In this video series, we'll delve into the biblical timeline of history. We aim to uncover the significance of important historical dates, such as the creation in 11,013 BC, the flood in 4990 BC, and even the date when God would bring judgment upon the house of God, the churches, as mentioned in 1 Peter 4:17. We'll also explore the date of Judgment Day, which is also alluded to in the same verse. And you might be wondering what the biblical timeline of history is and why it's important to learn. These dates weren't placed in the Bible arbitrarily. They serve a purpose beyond mere knowledge. God always has a reason for concealing truths within the Bible. These essential dates are not explicitly stated in verses, but require meticulous exploration through comparing Scripture with Scripture, the biblical method for revealing truth, mathematical analysis, and ultimately guidance from God's Holy Spirit. So what exactly is the biblical timeline of history? It's a timeline that spans across the Bible, beginning with the first book, Genesis. This timeline then extends into subsequent books and chapters. Why should we invest time in learning about the biblical timeline of history? The answer can be found in Ecclesiastes 8:5. Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. To comprehend the current time or season, understanding past biblical events is essential to understand when future events will occur that the Bible is prophesied about. In Matthew 16, we see Jesus rebuking the Pharisees and Sadducees for their inability to recognize the time and season they were living in. Matthew 16:2 and 3, He answered and said unto them, When it is evening, ye say, It will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times?
All right, welcome back everyone to another timeline series. Today it's just going to be me because Brian was not available. And this is going to be, let's see, I believe it's episode 30. And this is going to be part 4 of Crisis Timeline. So we're just going to kind of do like a review today because it's been about a month since we last went over this. And we'll go over some time paths and then go to our next program. So we'll go ahead and get started. I hope everyone can hear me. Okay. And by the way, I just want to remind everyone, if you have a difficult time following this program, we're going to try to sometime this year we're going to try to release a Roku special that goes through the whole timeline, but there won't be any gaps or pauses. It just kind of gets right into it. So it's more ideal for just kind of learning. This was our first attempt at laying out the timeline, but we have a way to, I feel like it should be a lot easier. And if you watched our Christmas special on YouTube, you would have got a little snippet of what I'm talking about. This one was just created for Christmas. If you go to the YouTube channel and hit videos, you're going to see the Christmas special, What Year Was Christ Born? And this kind of just does a quick path to get to Christ. It doesn't really go step by step through the patriarchs, but it does have like certain animations. And so I feel like it's more engaging for the audience to watch in this type of format. So we plan to release this timeline's Roku special sometime this year, probably within the next few months. I can't give an exact date. And then once we publish it, then we plan to translate the timeline series. So we have it in Spanish and, you know, uh, a bunch of other languages. And that's never been done before that I'm aware of. So, okay. To get started, I just want to confirm, well, my mic's unmuted, so I'm guessing people can hear me. Maybe somebody can write in the chat. I think Oliver said no sound. Just want to confirm someone can hear me. So what I'm going to do is, let's see. Oliver, I'm going to unmute you. Can you just let me know if everyone can hear me? Or Jeffrey?
You hear me, Carl?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
We hear
Okay.
you.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure because I saw a no sound. So
Yeah, initially it wasn't no sound, but
okay. Did you hear most of what I said?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
good. Okay. All right. So I'm sure most people remember to get to the timeline, go to the website. If you're new, you go to ebiblefellowship.org. You can scroll down and you'll see the timeline here on the home page. You just click timeline. Most people use their phones. So if you're on a phone, it's going to look a little bit different. And then you can also get to it on the right side. It says biblical timeline. So either way works. Click that. You can either scroll down or press enter, and you'll get to the timeline. Okay, so the last episode we were going over Christ, and we got to 7 BC. We showed different ways to get there. We also went over, we saw how David's reign compared to Christ's time on earth, and 1994 to 2033 all lined up. So I'm just going to go over that again because it's been a month and just to refresh people's minds. So we'll do that. So if you scroll down on the timeline, I just want to let people know, I don't know um, if people are struggling with using the timeline page. It's not, I haven't really focused on making it easily accessible. But for me, I'm using a laptop, so I'm able to kind of use my trackpad to go up and down. If you don't have a laptop and you have a mouse, what you can do is just click on the screen and then use your arrow keys, so left or right. It's a little bit slower, but it does allow you to scroll. I know some people try to go to the bottom of the page and scroll, but you're better off just using your arrow keys. So click on the timeline and you can just go up or down, left and right with the arrow keys. For me, I find it much easier just to use the trackpad. Okay, so we're gonna go over Christ again. We already looked at his birth. We saw that the 28 Jubilees lands on is 7 BC. So now we're kind of getting into 29 AD and 33 AD. And probably next Sunday we'll get more into detail as far as how Mr. Camping was able to narrow it down to the actual month that he was crucified in the day. In 33 AD, there's only a certain amount of Fridays that actually land on a Passover. So he that's another way to do it. But just for now, we're going to focus on some other proofs. So let's take a look here. Okay. So if you remember, if you click on Christ's lifespan right here, and you scroll down, you're going to see that we compared all three of these. Well, actually, there's four here. We have the 10,000th year era of Earth's history. So this would be right around the time where David begins to reign. The Earth is 10,000 years old. So when I say era, I just mean we're in that millennium, right? Maybe that would have been a better word. 11,000 year era would be the millennial of Christ. That's when he came, his first coming. The 12,000th era would be kind of the second part of the church age. So the church age really began in after 33 AD, but it finishes off that whole 11,000 year period, right? So that's why Mr. Camping, you'll see down here it says beginning of the church age, 33 AD, and that lasted for 1955 years of the church age, right? And the reason why it's not exactly 2000 is because the church age didn't begin with Christ's birth in 7 BC, or it would have been exact 2000, but it began about 40 years later, right? So you can see 1955 minus 2000 is 45, right? Okay, so the church age makes up that time period from 33 AD or after 33 AD all the way till 1988, right? It makes up that period of time. So it basically covers two millennials, the 11,000th era and the 12,000th era, and it ends the 13,000th era. So if we go back here, so yeah, it covers this era and it covers this era. And so, people may wonder, why do we jump 2,000 years, right? And I was actually watching a video online. I don't know if it was a YouTube short, but somebody who was like a Muslim or a Jew, I forget. I think it was a Muslim. It was interesting because they recognized the importance of 2,000 year marks, and they had the wrong timeline, but they understood, every 2,000 years, they had that idea in their mind. I'm not sure where they got it from. And so they actually think 2033 is important because they think it marks the 2000th year from the resurrection, which it does. They happen to be correct. And so people, even outside of e-Bible, they do understand that there's some significance, right? So, but however, what they don't understand is that we don't um, we don't count this 12,000th year era, and we explain that below because there's a principle in the Bible where there's 12, but there's actually 13. So you can think of the 12 apostles, right? But Paul made up the 13th apostle. So after Judas hung himself, he was replaced. So you still have 12 disciples or apostles, and Paul was that 13th apostle, right? And so, this is why we don't count or we don't look at dates within this era, not only because it was part of the church age, but really after Christ died on the cross, I think it was around 70 AD where divine revelation was sealed up. And so the Bible wasn't opened up until the end of time, to the 13,000th year. And so there's nothing for us to really glean from this era, right? So you can click this to close it, right? And so here we see a really important lineup. And what this does is this compares, and maybe some people don't know this, but um, this lineup compares the reign of David. So there's a certain pattern that existed here with the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. And we're going to see that here. So David began to reign in 1007 BC. We went through the king's timeline. We proved that, from going from 1447, 480 years. There's a verse that tells us to do that. We land in 967. Well, we know David reigned right before Saul, so that's Solomon, 967, right? You backtrack 4 years, you get to 971, and then from there you can backtrack to figure out the date that David began to reign. And maybe I'll just show that real fast. So right here, this marked the 480th year period from the Exodus. The Exodus was in 1447, exactly 480 years later, we land in 967. Okay. So because we have this date, that's how we can get to David. Without this date, we wouldn't know the reign of David. We know we can jump from Jacob's birth to when David began to reign, but we first had to understand this information. So if Solomon laid the foundation of the temple in 967, all you have to do is backtrack. That was his fourth year, so backtrack to his first year, and you got to include his non-accession year. And then from here, we can backtrack David's life all the way into 1007 BC, right? So that's how we get to 1007 BC, which also that marks the 10,006th year of Earth's history. So that's how old the Earth is at this point. And so you're going to see a pattern here. You're going to see 10,006, jump 1,000 years, you're going to see 11,006. We're skipping the 12,000th era. So now we're jumping 2,000 years and you get to 13,006. So you see this number pattern that God has established here. It's a very definite pattern. And you may ask, well, why doesn't it just start with 10,000? Why the number six for each of these? And you'll notice, for example, the 13,000th year was 1988. With the 11,000th year era, it's this is the era when Christ is born, right? So it marked that era, but Christ wasn't born until 6 years later, right? And then David, uh, the 10,000 year era marked when David would come, and David's a picture of Christ. So, but yet the pattern doesn't start until 6 years later, right? So it starts 6 years later in 10,006. That's the age of the earth. That's the first year that David begins to reign. And by the way, this is a Jubilee year. So this is also Jubilee. Christ was born on Jubilee, which means 1994 was also Jubilee, because the Jubilee is every 50 years. So 1,000 divided by 50 is 20. So every 1,000 years, there's 50 Jubilee. There's 50 Jubilee. Sorry. There's 20 50 Jubilees, Jubilee periods. Okay. So we've already fulfilled this pattern here because David already reigned in 1007 BC. 1,000 years later, Christ was born. 2,000 years later, we landed on 1994. So this is why Mr. Camping put a question mark on 1994, is because he saw that this was such a significant date because it followed this pattern, but he didn't understand it was actually the beginning of a pattern because you have to follow it through, right? And so as we do that, like if we look at David's reign, we scroll down, we see, for example, in 971, he begins to co-reign with Solomon. You can see that here. 971 was the first year that he reigns with Solomon, with King David. Solomon co-reigns. And so that was a significant event. And then exactly 1,000 years later is 29 AD. That's when Christ begins his ministry, when he was baptized, when John said, "Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world." Okay, now, why is there an offset here? You'll notice that. Whereas like this, with this pattern, it's a perfect line. The reason there's a bit of an offset is because in this case, you have to count inclusive. So what that means is you start the count at 971 and you count that year as the first year, rather than what the calculator will do is it'll actually go to the next year. It'll count this as the first year, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, right? So you count 971 as the first year, and we know inclusive versus non-inclusive are both legitimate ways to count. And you'll land exactly on 29 AD. Now I'll show this on the calculator. 971 plus 1,000 years, and you land in 29 AD. Now we have to add the 1 because there's no year 0, and you get 30 AD. However, because we can count inclusive, so if you actually count this year, you can backtrack just 1 year and it'll count 29 AD. So that's how we count inclusive. And then from here, from 29 AD, you just go 1,000 years, actually 2,000, I'm sorry, because we're skipping the 12,000th era, and you land in 2029. And so you can see that we have this lineup here. This pattern started here. This was already fulfilled because David and Solomon co-reigned. 29 AD was fulfilled because Christ was baptized. But yet we haven't seen this fulfilled yet. And so we don't know if perhaps maybe something could happen in 2029, because you do have this pattern. We don't know what could happen, but it's definitely something worth looking into. And then finally, at the very end of David's life, which is 967, David dies. Now, what's interesting about this is exactly 1,000 years later, Christ dies on the cross. Now, why is that significant? Well, David's a picture of Christ. And again, you count inclusive. So David dies, 1,000 years later, Christ dies. 2,000 years later, the world dies, 2033. So you can see that pattern. Now, Christ and David, or David's a picture of Christ, so the way that we can understand that is David's death pictured Christ's death. And actually, what's interesting is we're going through hell ourselves, and that's when it ends right there. But uh, you can see the pattern here, and then also Christ resurrected in 33 AD, and so this is why we believe the resurrection will happen in 2033 AD. It's fulfilling this pattern here. So these are the last two dates that we have yet to see to complete this. Okay. Now, that's getting into 1994 and 2033, but the timeline, it's all connected. So even though we're talking about Christ's lifespan, this kind of serves as a proof because it does um, or added proof to what we already know. It does really kind of add to that evidence. Okay. So and here this gets into 29 AD when Christ's ministry began. So we'll talk more about that because there are other ways to arrive at 29 AD and also 33 AD. And I did want to point out that 33 AD is um, it's uh, it comes from the Bible, but it's also it's known to be the year that Christ died. It's common, right? If you type in on Google, let's see what year. Maybe look at ChatGPT. That most scholars and historians agree it occurred in the range of 30 to 33 AD, right? And I think it's more commonly held that it's 33 AD. And Mr. Camping talks about this in one of his books, how he was able to narrow it down because the Passover, Christ died on Passover, and there's only a few dates that actually land on Friday for being the Passover. So we'll get into that more later. But just to show you, I mean, that's a very small range, Okay. And again, we're going to just go back to some time paths here. So last time, I think we looked at Abraham's time path. And if you're not familiar with the time path, if you look on the timeline, we have all these patriarchs, and patriarchs can lead to significant dates. And what I mean by that is if you take, for example, Abraham, right? Abraham's 175, and you just replicate his lifespan, 175. We find if you do that 23 times. So if you don't count this first one, you count this one as the first one. If you do that 23 times, you land exactly on 2033/2034. Again, you got to count inclusive if you want to get to 2033. So what that equals is 4,200 years. And we talked about the 4,200 years. Chris has mentioned this in his studies. 14 plus 14 plus 14 equals 42. And we'll read that verse. Let's see. So it says, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David unto the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. Now, if you actually were to look at the time from Abraham to David, for example, we can't see if we look at this verse literally, we don't see 14 generations evenly for each of these. Like for example, we know Abraham was born in 2167 BC, right? 2167. And we just looked on this timeline and we see David is born, well, actually, we got to go to this one. Click on the king's timeline. We see David's born in the year 10,037 because he's 30 years old when he begins to reign. So 10,037, you got to add 30. and you get to 1007. That's when he begins to reign, but he was born in the year 10,037. So if you look at the difference between Abraham's birth and David, that's 1,130 years. Kind of interesting you see the 130. But yeah, this is exactly 1,130 years. But if you go from David to Babylon, so from unto David unto the carrying away into Babylon, well, we know that the carrying away into Babylon was 609 BC, or was it, let's see. So we know that that 70-year tribulation began in 609. So 609 BC, this is when the last good king, King Josiah, dies. And this tribulation lasts for 70 years. We went over this. 609 BC. This is when it started, but it ended in the tribulation ended in 539 BC. That's when Cyrus took over. This was the midpoint when the last king was dethroned, Jehoiakim, in 587. So that would be the midpoint. But if we start at 609, so 609, so we're going from David unto Babylon. Um, let's see. So here you only have 428-year difference from David until 609. If we were to count the end of the tribulation, this is the carrying away into Babylon, so it could only have been 609 or 587. So 450 versus 428. So it's a little bit more than 400 years. So from Abraham to David is 1130 years, but from David into the carrying away of Babylon is a little bit over 400 years. So that's quite a difference. So how could it be 14 generations now? Generations aren't always exact either, right? Because a generation could be somebody's whole lifespan. But again, if you go through each of these, we don't count 14 generations, right? Uh, and then from the carrying away of Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. So if the carrying away of Babylon was 609 and Christ was born in 7 BC, that's 602 years. So we got 11 and 30, 430, and 602 years. So each of these time frames vary. This could be 430, 428 actually. So that it's not exact, right, as far as years. And so what Chris did is he just added up the 14 generations. So if you do that 3 times, because it's mentioned 3 times, you get the number 42. And if you view this spiritually, right, like Abraham, he's a picture of Christ. David also is a picture of Christ. And Christ is Christ, right? So these are both types and figures of Christ. So if we go from Abraham to Christ and we understand that the carrying away of Babylon represents the Great Tribulation, because that's a type and figure of the 23-year tribulation, then unto Christ would be after the tribulation. So this could take us to 2033, because that's when Judgment Day ends and the elect go to Christ, right? So if we go back on the timeline, we look at Abraham's lifespan. So if we go from Abraham all the way to Christ, we get exactly 4,200 years. So we added 2 zeros because 42 years wouldn't take you anywhere, and we have biblical precedent to do that. Because, for example, like Ezekiel laid on his side a day for a year, right? So in this case, we can add 2 zeros, and that takes us right to 2033. However, we have more confirmation if we can do this, because what is interesting is if you take Abraham's lifespan of 175 and you replicate it, that equals, you replicate it 23 times, you get to 4,200 years. So 175 times 24 gets you exactly 4,200. So God is letting us know that the reason why he chose this number for Abraham, for him to live that long, is to show this proof here that he lands in 2033. Now, there's three other numbers that we can look at that also do the same thing. And these are significant numbers in Abraham's life, at least these two are. So Abraham had a son named Isaac at 100 years old, right? When he was 100 years old, Isaac was born. And Isaac is the promise seed. So if you go 100 years, 42 times, you also get to 2033. It lands you exactly on the same year. So 100 times 42, that's basic math. You get to 4200. So again, this is how God uses numbers. He's showing there's different ways to get to that end time date. You don't have to just use 175. He highlighted this number in Abraham's life for a reason, and it's to show that it's another way to get to the 4200 years. And this is exactly, and I think it's maybe perhaps possible that each of these represent a generation because there's exactly 42 of them, and 100 is like the number for completeness. And so perhaps 42 of these hundreds equal to 42 generations. I don't know for sure, but that's just a thought. And then I don't know if we went over this last time, but Abraham, when he turned 75, he left the Ur of the Chaldees. So we can look that up. See. So this is in Genesis 12. So it says, "And now Jehovah had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." Um, and it says here, "So Abraham departed as Jehovah had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran." Now, if you read Time Has an End, Mr. Camping said uh, that when he left Ur of the Chaldees, that represented Babylon, because that's where ancient Babylon was built. And he's going into Canaan, that represents the promised land. And so, but that's happening at age 75. So why is God highlighting 75 years old? Now, Mr. Camping didn't talk about this time path. I don't think he knew about it, but it turns out if you actually follow out this time path, so if you start at 75 and do 75 replications, do replications of 75, then you get, let's see, you get 56. So there's 56 75-year periods, and that lands you in 2033. Again, these all equal 4,200 years. It's just different ways to break down the numbers. So again, this is how God uses numbers. We can just see if you take 4,200, it divides evenly into 175, into 100, into 75. It's an even divide. So this is how we can understand these numbers. And I think God is teaching a spiritual truth that for example, him leaving Ur of the Chaldees, that pictures God's elect leaving Babylon and going into the promised land. And so is it surprising that his 75 years takes us to 2033? We've been talking about the promised land is heaven, right? And we've been going through the wilderness, so it makes sense that from Babylon, we're in the world. That's when Abraham first leaves at 75, and we make it all the way to the promised land. That last 75, right? That takes us to 2033. So I believe with this time path, that's how we can view the spiritual meaning of time paths here. Now, how we view this one, I'm not sure, like his whole lifespan, but it also takes us to that date. Okay. And then 100, perhaps what God could be teaching here is completeness, because 100 is the number for completeness. So, and also it's exactly 42. So maybe that relates to the 42 generations. But I'm not really sure. I mean, Isaac is born, and Isaac represents the elect. He's that promised seed. He's also a picture of Christ. So he's born when Abraham's 100. So there's definitely a spiritual portrait there. I'm not sure what that would be. And then finally, we have this last one that I had that Chris actually reminded me about. And the Bible doesn't speak of when Abraham was 40, but it turns out that you can actually break down 4,200 into 105 sets of 40. So you start here. So from Abraham's birth until he's 40 years old, and you just keep replicating the 40s, and eventually you land on 2033. So again, it equals 4,200. 105 times 40 years equals 4,200 years. Now you're going to see why I'm bringing this up in just a second, but I just wanted to point that out. Okay. All right. So let's go to Moses' time path. So we were looking at this one before, and if you don't remember, we looked and saw that if you take Moses's lifespan of 120 and you replicate that 13 times, you land on 33 AD. So, we have multiple time paths that take us to significant dates, like 7 BC, 33 AD. And so in this case, Moses' life actually his lifespan takes us to 2033. So if you take his birth, which was 1527 BC, and you add the 120, that's when he dies, and then you times that by 13, you get 33 AD. Now, we got to add the 1 because we're crossing over from BC to AD. So you get 34. However, this is when we count inclusive. You get 33 AD. So counting inclusive, Moses lands on 33 AD. That's his whole lifespan. If you try to take his lifespan farther than this, it doesn't go anywhere. So this is as far as it would take us. Okay. And again, that's 120 times 13 is 1560. That's what that number is. So it's exactly 1,560 years from Moses' birth until Christ's death on the cross. Okay. Um, we also saw that Moses' lifespan can be broken up into 3 sets of 40. So when he flees Egypt, when he's a shepherd in Midian, so he returns to Egypt, that's when God meets him by the burning bush. And then this is when he's in the wilderness. So we can see that 120 breaks down into 3 sets of 40. And the reason I thought this was interesting is because I think God was urging us to look, to don't stop there, keep seeing where these 40 take you, on the timeline. And it turns out that the whole Judges period is made up of all 40 years. So if you ended here with Moses' death, that third 40, which is right here, then you have 9 periods of 40 years that fit into 360. So 40 times 9 equals 360. So all the Judges period is made up of all these 40-year periods. And you can see that clearly. The land had rest 40 years. The land had rest 80 years. 40, 40. You just see it through the Judges period. Some of these add up to 40, right? You have 23 plus 22, but when you add up all these numbers, even though they're not all even, you get exactly 9 sets of 40. And then, not surprisingly, Saul, he's the first king. So Samuel dies, he's that last judge. Saul reigns for 40 years. David reigns for 40 years. So already we have just a stream of 40s that get us to David's rule right here. And then, if you continue the pattern, then you get to Christ's, you actually get to 7 BC when you do this. That takes you to 7 BC, and that takes you to 33 AD. So Moses' time path, which I find very interesting, takes you, if you go in increments of 40, not in 120, increments of 40, you land on 7 BC and 33 AD. So let's take 1527 plus 40, and we're going to times that by, let's see, it's 38 40s. So 38 40s gets you to 7 BC. If you go one more set of 40, 39 40s, you get to 33 AD. So isn't that kind of curious? You have 40 and you have 39. Remember, Paul was whipped 39 times. They save one. So 40 and 39 are interchangeable, right? Okay. So then if you stop there and start the count again, so from after Christ dies on the cross, you continue the 40-year pattern. Guess where it lands you? You land on 1994 and you land on 2033, both of those dates. And if you count all the 40s, it totals to 89 40s. However, 89, I don't know if there's any significance there. But if you start the count again, like if you stop here, this is the 39th 40, and just start it again. So this is 1, 2, 3. This is exactly 50 40s. 40 times 50. Why is 50 significant? That's the number for the Jubilee. 40 times 50 equals 2,000 years. So that's why, if people are wondering why do we go 2,000 years from the resurrection, well, this is kind of a proof of why it can do that, because all these 40s equal out to 2,000 years. So, but it first lands on 1994 and 2033. So, what's interesting is Moses takes us to the first coming of Christ, and he takes us to the second coming of Christ. Now, compare that with this, what we learned over here. Pull that up. Okay, so compare that with this. David takes you, if you go 1,000-year jumps, it takes you to Christ's first coming and his second coming. Same exact pattern, just a different way to view it. Right here, we're reviewing it in 40-year periods, but we're doing 1,000-year jumps, right? Except for in this case, we're doing a 2,000-year jump. So I think that this pattern right here really shows proof for all these dates. It just kind of builds onto the evidence. It also shows we're on the right track with 2033. And this is something I forgot to mention, but Mr. Camping, or I briefly mentioned it. He saw the importance of 1994 and of course of 2011, but he didn't realize we haven't finished the pattern. You can't stop here, you have to finish it. So it doesn't finish until 2033. After that, there's nothing left. We can't go anymore by David's rule because he dies here. And also Christ dies on the cross in 33 AD. So, once we reach 2033, this pattern is fulfilled. And I think Chris might have said it doesn't happen again for another 1,000 years. And by then all the elect would be gone. And so it's, this I think could be more evidence that 2033 is it, because it completes this pattern. And not to mention it's 40 years. It's 39 if you count a session, and non-accession it's 40 years. Well, we're not counting, it's not a king, so we can say inclusive versus non-inclusive. We get to there, and this may tie in with the stripes, God not going over 40 stripes. And this is why we say judgment officially began in 1994, because the 39th stripe lands here. Or if you count inclusive, it's the 40th stripe. I don't know if you can view stripes as years, but there's definitely find that interesting. Okay, we got about 10 minutes left. If anyone has any questions, by the way, about what we went over on the timeline, or if something wasn't clear, you can feel free to raise your hand. Okay. Let's see. So let me refresh the page here. All right, so we went over Abraham, time path again. We went over Moses. So that was an important one. And you'll notice Moses isn't a patriarch, that's needed to go on the timeline. But yet God gives us his birth and death year. And we see he's actually significant. He actually is very significant because he takes you to very significant dates. So it's not a coincidence that God gives us his birth and death. And likewise, I believe the same is for these other patriarchs. I don't think we know their births and deaths for no reason. I'm not sure about Joseph because I tried to do his 110 and that didn't really take you anywhere. But if you look at his other periods of life, like for example, when he's taken in, his brothers kidnap him and throw him in a pit, he's 17 years old. And if you take the 17 years and you replicate that, I found it does land on very significant dates, such as 1994, and I believe it lands on 2029, and some other significant dates. We can go over that later. Now, not every patriarch lands on a significant date. Only certain patriarchs do. So we're just going to look over one more because I don't think we'll have much time. We've touched upon Ishmael. There's not really much we know about Ishmael. Like we can't break down 137, and God doesn't give us. I don't think you can break down 137 evenly, and God doesn't give us any other time period in his life except for maybe when he was 8 or 13. I forget exactly. But interestingly enough, he does land exactly on 2029/2030, so you got to count inclusive. But okay, so and also Amram, he's another one. If you take his 137, he happens to be placed exactly on the timeline where he lands on 2033 as well. And in this case, you'll notice it's actually, you don't count inclusive, it's actually exact, I believe. So let me see. 1667 plus 137, timesing that by 27. So 27 of his lifespans gets you to 2032. Now we're not counting inclusive. We can add 1 year and get to 2033. And this would just be a direct path without counting inclusive. And so this means we're not counting the year he was born. Just like a calculator, it begins with the next year. Both counts are legitimate though. You can count inclusive or non-inclusive. So in this case, it's just non-inclusive. Okay. We already went over these time paths. They both take you to Christ, which again, these are part of the these are all made up of 40s anyways. So they're just part of Moses's time paths here. So it starts here, which would be this 40, this fourth 40. And it would just take you all the way to Christ. So, you know, Mr. Campion had noticed that there's 1440 years from the Exodus to Christ's birth. But also, this is how we got to Christ from 1407 to Christ's birth. We saw that there was a 50, 28, 50 Jubilee year periods, but it's also made up of 35, 40-year periods of time. So again, it's just two different ways to look at these time paths, but these basically connect with these 40. And then the 440 years from Moses. So Moses was the first judge, technically. They thrust him away and they said, who made thee a judge? So that was at age 40. So if you start there and you go all the way to Samuel, you have exactly 440 years. Now, Acts talks about a 450-year period, but it says about. So if we do exactly 440, we get to 2033. So that's 440 times 8. So 8 of these basically gets you to 2033. And again, if you zoom out here, you'll see it really just connects with the 40-year time path because these can all be broken up into periods of 40. So again, I mean, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but you just see 40 highlighted over and over and over again. and 40 is the number for testing. So 440 divided by 40 is 1140s. So each of these are made up of 1140s, which connect with this. Okay, now I did want to mention this last thing before we end the program, and that is, give me a second. Okay, so with Jacob, so I told, I think last episode, I had said that maybe the way we can view Moses' time path is that God began testing mankind when Moses was born, and he's just been testing them in 40-year segments. And 1994 would have marked that last 40. And I was thinking about making a video calling it the final 40, because ever since we hit 1994 and we go to 2033, this would be that last 40-year period. So, Chris has talked a lot about the 40-year period from 1994 to 2033, but perhaps mentioning less about how it's a lot of all these 40s led up to this last 40. And this would obviously be very important, and it was part of this 40-year period. Now, I had said that perhaps we can view this as Moses, when he was born, all the way to 2033, God's been testing mankind this many times, and this would be that final 40-year period where he's testing mankind. However, you can actually backtrack. So if you click this 40, you'll see that you can actually go backwards. And interestingly enough, when you do that, you can land on when Jacob was 120. So if you click Jacob's tab here, it says in 1887, Jacob and Esau are 120 years old. They bury their father Isaac, who dies at 180. Joseph is 29 years old, 1 year before Joseph is freed from prison and stands before Pharaoh at age 30. So 1887, so this 40 year increment can take you back as far as 1887, right? And 120 is interesting too, because Moses lived to be 120. So God's highlighting Jacob and remember, Jacob and Esau are twins. So if Jacob's 120, that means Esau has to be 120. That's how we can keep track of both of their lives. Now, if you go back to when Jacob was 40, so this 40 right here at the beginning, Jacob's born, and then 40 years later, right here, he's 40 years old. Now, Jacob and Esau are both 40 years old at this point in time, right here. And even though God doesn't mention when Jacob was 40, he does mention when Esau was 40. Let me pull that up. All right, that's Genesis 26:34. Okay, Genesis 26:34. And Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beriah the Hittite, and Bashemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. So, which were a grief of mine unto Isaac and Rebekah. So, Chris pointed out that Esau failed the test at 40 years old because he married an unsaved woman, right? And what he noticed is if you go on the timeline, when Jacob is 40 years old, right here, Jacob and Esau, they're both 40 years old. Esau fails the test right here. Well, that was in the year, so Jacob was born in 2007, plus 40 years. You land in the year 1967, right? 1967. If you keep going in 40-year segments, let's see, 100 times, you land on 2033, right? You got to count inclusive. And so, in other words, the way we can view this is God has been testing Jacob and Esau picture the elect and the non-elect. and Esau is a picture of the non-elect. And so we could say mankind fails the test on 2033 because that's how many 40s. You have 100 40s from when Jacob and Esau are both 40, right? And 100's the number for completeness. And so that last 40 that they're being tested, you can say it's the complete testing period, right? So 2033, mankind fails the test, and technically Jacob passed the test because he didn't marry a strange wife. It wasn't until he was 67, so about 27 years later, he marries um, Leah and Rebecca, right? And so, but he's a picture of the elect. So the elect passed the test, which represent Jacob. Esau fails the test, which represents mankind. But I think God's more highlighting the fact that Esau fails at his 40th year. And so it's exactly 4,000 years. 40 times 100 is exactly 4,000 years. So when we hit 2033, 4,000 years prior, Esau would have been 40 when he failed the test. Again, when we hit 2033, Abraham, that would have been 4,200 years when Abraham was born. And so you can really see how God uses numbers in this way. Now, looks like guys here. So we're going to start the Bible reading just a moment. There's one other 40. So I noticed this 40 right here. I think we went over that. That was when Jacob was 120. They bury Esau. This is when Jacob and Esau are both 40 years old on this 40. This one, it shouldn't be in yellow. But we can go as far back as this 40. This 40 takes us to Abraham's birth. So I try to go back further, and you really can't. So what we can say is that from Abraham's birth, God has been testing mankind until 2033. And that's not surprising because when you look at Abraham's life, you see how he's constantly being tested. He's tested with Isaac, right? With leaving his homeland, with the promised seed in his old age. He's tested with sacrificing his son Isaac. And so there's already a series of tests in Abraham's life. And what's interesting too is Abraham really started a pivotal point in the timeline. And Mr. Camping pointed this out, is that if you start from the very beginning of time, we learned a little bit about the lives of like Adam, for example. But we don't really know too much about these other patriarchs. And, we don't really hear of any of them being saved except for Enoch and Noah. But as soon as we get to Noah, this is when we learn more about his life, right? And this is when God makes a change in the timeline. Because here we can see that they all line up. They're all immediate sons. But then here, we're viewing them as separate generations. And Mr. Camping pointed out that as soon as Noah died, or as soon as Lamech died, you couldn't have added a next generation because his generation would have died off at the time of the flood. So he had to go through Noah. Okay. So anyways, from Noah all the way to Abraham. So again, we don't hear of anyone who's saved. God does the same pattern. He separates the generations all the way until you get to Terah and Abraham, right? You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is when he tested Noah, right? And so this is the next major patriarch that God starts a testing program with Abraham. And Abraham takes us to the end of the world. And is that surprising? Because Noah takes us to the end of the world. From Noah's birth, you can get to 2011, or at least to Judgment Day. And also, Noah's lifespan takes you to 2011. So Abraham, he takes us to the end of Judgment Day, which would be 2033. So anyways, we're going to end the program here, and we'll let Guy in to do Bible reading.